Bruce Catton you just brought up, Avery Craven. Now, you're saying in the book that he was hoping to unite the country through mutual tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
Avery Craven wrote of him, though, that it was prose and triumphalism over substance. Was Catton delusional
No, Catton wasn't delusional. He was
in trying to create this
Catton.
mutual tragedy for us?
No, Catton was a contradictory writer in the sense that Catton wanted the tragedy to be thoroughly redemptive in the end, and indeed in Catton's writing and in his work, it was, and in his public speaking, it was. Catton viewed the American Civil War as a horrible, tragic bloodletting that came about because of a set of forces that collided that couldn't be stopped. But in the end, he saw the Civil War as the event that ultimately would unify us and make us greater and make us better.
Do you see this coming out of our anniversary now, the 150th?
I think our anniversary now has made a good start. There have been many conferences.
The idea of redemption and so on.
Yeah. I think Ken Burns contributed mightily to the epic sense of the Civil War and its redemptive qualities. That's Ken Burns. That's his view of people and of history.
Yeah.
Ken knows an epic.
That was 20 years ago.
It was 20 years ago. I think the jury's still out. I think, frankly, most Americans still want their history to be, in the end, essentially triumphal. And by that, I'm not suggesting that we have to all become, dark, folks who just see the past like the Russians do. Or, I mean, you go abroad and you sometimes, people will ask you, why do Americans have such a sunny outlook? Now, maybe we don't anymore after 9/11. But I often say to them, I say to my own students, that American history is full of as much tragedy, well, virtually as much tragedy as anybody else's. It's just that we've been taught over and over and over, for a lot of good reasons, that we are the almost chosen people. That our history's on a
that's what
trajectory
Nixon said,
upward. Of course he did, and he believed that, and all
He believed
presidents,
that, right.
all presidents have to say that. But the job of historians is not merely to reinforce the narratives we like and the narratives we want. Our job is to kind of try to find out what really happened.
Right.
Tragedy is a complicated concept, but in the end, it really comes down to this notion that, if we understand these deep, terrible, sometimes horrifyingly bloody events of the past, we might not be so shocked why they keep happening to us again. Everybody in this room and everybody out there remembers in the wake of 9/11, we all responded with the reaction of, how could this happen? And why do they hate us? And how could this happen in America? How could this happen in New York? Well, it turns out that has a story, too, of how it could happen. And in the wake of 9/11, I don't know if the rest of you remember, I collected a huge file of all the journalism that was being written about how this time everyone was saying Americans would finally lose their innocence. Innocence, innocence, innocence was the word.
Mm-hmm.
And I gave one of my first major book talks on race and reunion in New York City 8 days after 9/11. And I decided I had to have something to say to New Yorkers, so I went and I looked at 4 other times in American history where we supposedly had lost our innocence and then regained it. Mm-hmm. And I simply said, we are perhaps losing our innocence this time. I hope so, but don't be so sure. And a year later we invaded Iraq, and I think in part out of a certain innocence.
Yeah.
That's a long answer.
I don't think that was innocence, but that's another story.
Well, no, I mean,
I'm
I mean
not-
innocence
no,
in the
that
sense
was not innocence.
of not understanding perhaps the region of the world we were invading, or whatever.
Partially that too, but let's not go there.
No, it's not. Sorry about that.
Let's
Sorry
go
about
to
that.
something else which is also problematical, in that people like to look back on their ancestors and feel good about them. And I'm going to ask both of you about this.
Sure.
How are Southerners coming to both from the centennial to the sesquicentennial? Robert Penn Warren's grandfather, you write in here, was taught you go with your people.
Right. Right.
Which has also been said, the people to defend the right to lynch and keep white jobs.
That was his grandson's comment on
Yeah,
his grandson.
that's right, exactly it. So how do people cope with the reality of their ancestors' deeds in today's world when we're trying to look at the Civil War through different eyes.
Well, I had two great-grandfathers in the Confederate Army, and I've coped with it, and so has my family and others. Well, one died of disease in the Army, and the other survived and all. But I don't know. It's more open now. You can, in class and so on, you can say good things about Lincoln, and nobody will put out a contract on you or anything. In
It was
fact, there's a great.
controversial in Richmond when the Tredegar put
I
up
know
the Lincoln
that's in Richmond.
statue.
That was in Richmond, and you get a few of these people. That's true. In North Carolina, though, you occasionally come across someone who say, "Oh, Lincoln was a tyrant," and he didn't mean it. And that's another thing. The issue of slavery. Was Lincoln really an anti-slavery? Was he that strong anti-slavery?
Well,
Now
yes,
you'll
he
get
was. But,
he
but
was,
he was
but
also
that's
constitutionalist.
what that's what people will throw at you, will throw up at you. You see, and so you have to explain his position and so on. So no, it's a fairly healthy situation now, certainly in North Carolina regarding the Civil War. We have Civil War roundtables in which we have Northerners and Southerners who would come together and so on. So no, you don't have this kind of. You may have a lot of joking about it and so on, but that's about it. And most people have no idea what the Civil War was about anyway. I mean, they don't think about it. They're busy with their families. And
They're worried about the Alabama-Florida game, but
yeah,
maybe not.
and the game's tomorrow.
Right. Well, this is a huge question. I didn't have any ancestors in the Civil War, but we do have a study now that shows that one of every 3 Americans can trace his or her ancestry to the Civil War, which is phenomenal when you think of all the new immigration that's happened in this country in the last 50 years. So it does begin with family. But there are many Souths now,
right,
many
there's
different
South,
Souths.
and I think World War II had a tremendous impact on attitudes towards the Civil War.
As did the Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah, right. But the Civil Rights Movement may have taken a step backwards in that regard in terms of attitudes. The Brown decision.
It made the South solid again politically.
Yeah, right.
And now they're
but
called
before
Republicans.
that, it was the war. I was a kid during World War II, and
Sure.
the Civil War, as far as I was concerned, was something that happened back in the Middle Ages or sometimes. I wasn't that interested in it. But I was interested in World War II and the kind of progressive idea that, maybe America is special.
I found
And that
after
came
war-
out of that.
After 9/11, I wondered about the Civil War being relevant. I did, and especially in this shop. And I thought, I was not really interested in Civil War now. It's a different world. Yet it's crept back in, and
Oh, Lord.
your book certainly describes how there are still issues that are here today that we are grappling with and are going to be.
Well,
part
the language
assessment.
of the Cold War is all over the language of the Civil War centennial. The language of post 9/11 has crept in, as it has here tonight, and maybe it's my fault, but has crept into our discussion of the Civil War era. To your question, I mean, nobody's responsible for the sins of their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers, but we are responsible to our own time, to our own country, to our own civilization that inherits those sins and still has to face them. We are responsible for the past we inherit in the present, for which, we contend with one another about what the past means in the present. It doesn't mean I'm guilty because my great-great-grandfather did something or my father did something. We can be responsible without being guilty or otherwise. That's true in Germany, it's true here, it's true anywhere one wants to look at it.
Yeah.
Think of the countries in the world that are now trying to overthrow dictators that slaughtered their own people. I mean, how does that get passed on? How is that passed on to their next generation? Who's responsible in Libya for Gaddafi? this
Obviously
generation
America.
and the next gen. Well, the French really.
French
ran it.
first. Okay, well, that's
There's
the
a
Battle
good
of
book,
Algiers, a wonderful
a
movie.
good book coming out on Kentucky and its memory.
Oh,
and
I've
and the lost cause
Oh.
in Kentucky. I cite the book in the end, and she helped me on with something.
Oh. Yes,
Marshall,
okay,
right? Yeah,
Sarah.
and
A
Marshall,
book waiting
right,
to be
yeah.
written. I mean, that
Right,
old
right,
story.
yeah.
You know, that Kentucky was in the Union during the war, but became very Confederate after the
Yeah,
war.
right.
Needed
They
a
joined
history
the
done with it.
Confederacy
They
after
joined
the
the
war.
Confederacy after the war. And did they ever?
Yeah,
I
they
mean,
really
the lost
did,
cause
right,
was
yeah.
as potent in Kentucky as it was anywhere.
I'm going to put both of you to work for just a moment signing books. We can sign
Mm-hmm.
for you now, and anyone who wishes a book online can still get it, and we'll have some of these signed for later on as well. And I'm just very briefly going to mention just a few of you out there, not everyone, and please, if I don't mention your name, I'll get it next time, or I have in the past. Just a quick potpourri of those of you who are out there. James in Fort Worth, Texas, excuse me. John in Indianapolis, Indiana. Diane in Marysville, Michigan. Frank in Turner, Oregon. Sally came back to us
Hey, Sally.
and said that she was looking at Ford's Theater, the Lincoln Memorial,
Oh.
and the Lincoln statue in Richmond.
The big ones. The big
Her
ones.
research so far has shown that the sites have initially fostered reconciliation,
Reconciliation,
yeah,
sure.
but over time transformed to the emancipationist point of view.
Yeah.
So essentially, she's saying Lincoln reflects both of those.
Well, he does reflect both of those. And Sally, sorry, but if you haven't read this book yet, I opened the book, the introduction, with a narrative of Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. The dream, however, does not come in that speech until the final 3 minutes, where it's extemporaneous. The first 14 minutes of that great speech was scripted, and it's all about the 100th anniversary of emancipation and the Civil War. That's the great Civil War centennial speech of that era, and he opens with the word 5 instead of 4, appropriating Lincoln. It is your point that the Lincoln Memorial over time has been used and appropriated by every conceivable kind of group. It has become now more, perhaps, in our popular imagination, a symbol of the civil rights movement as much as it is anything else, perhaps because of the imagery of King and the Dream speech. It all depends on when in time you look at this story of how Lincoln is represented. And Ford's Theater's just been wonderfully rehabilitated into a great theater that it once was.
Yes, it is. That's true. There was a comment for you, Bill, that Tennessee is also tough on Lincoln today. So just to say that.
It depends upon where you are in Tennessee. East Tennessee, I don't think is tough on Lincoln because they were Unionists.
Yeah,
there.
Lincoln Memorial University
Right.
is there, Harrogate.
Right, yeah.
How about around Murfreesboro? That's Nathan Bedford Forrest country.
That's true, right, yeah, right.
Ronell also just comments that we have compelling and introspective speakers, and we thank you for that. We try to have that. Now, David, a graduate student here in Chicago, has asked, what about the period between 1913 and the Civil Rights era? Is there any significant scholarship that covers Civil War memory during this period?
Not really. Yes, I had considered trying to write Race and Reunion the next 50 years, but it was too big and I didn't want to do that. There have been a few things written about Civil War memory in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. There's even better work on Lincoln, frankly, in American memory during that era and over time. The 1930s in particular would make a nice little book about Civil War memory when you just think about what's happening in the 1930s with Gone with the Wind and so much else going on. The recreations of numerous Lincolns in movies. Maybe a 30s, 40s book on that would be really quite worth doing. So somebody out there should write that one.
Bill, John Charles Fremont, the Pathfinder.
Right.
I actually once owned and handled the proclamation, a copy of the proclamation, in his hand, written that day and signed by him. And it went to the Lincoln Museum in Fort Wayne. Now the Allen County Public Library has that. I'm just going to ask a question. Is there, just briefly say what it was. what Fremont did, how he was put down by Lincoln, and Jessie, Fremont's wife, never forgave Lincoln for that.
Right.
But was there much of a difference between Lincoln's later Emancipation Proclamation and what Fremont was doing?
Well,
I mean,
Fremont
both were military necessities, they thought.
Yes, but he did it on his authority, and Lincoln says he does not have that kind of authority. And furthermore, at that particular point, Kentucky was on the fence, very much so. And the legislature was meeting, and they had just decided to go with the Union. But Joshua Speed, James Speed, and others in Kentucky told Lincoln, said, you've got to revoke that, get Fremont first to do that. Well, Fremont refused to do so. He did not see the importance of Kentucky, or for that matter, if Kentucky went, Lincoln thought Missouri. That's what he told Orville Browning. Missouri would go, and then Maryland, and we might as well just give up the U.S. Capitol. So Fremont was rather rash, and he wasn't a very good military commander either. Ultimately, that's his military failures were the reason for his removal. Now, you mentioned Jessie. She went to Washington with this Fremont's response that he would not revoke it. Lincoln did. Lincoln went on and did so. And she went into the White House, and they had a very testy meeting, to say the least. She reported on this immediately after, and Lincoln did to a friend right after that as well. She actually waved a handkerchief in her handkerchief in his face and denounced him, and said, if you keep treating my husband this way, we'll make issues with you. She meant political issues in the next election, which for a time he did, of course. So Fremont was sort of a loose cannon in a way, and it was a big mistake to appoint him there. And Lincoln and the Blairs were behind it initially, but they gave up on him too.
Yeah, they did, and Fremont was not happy with the Blairs.
Right, but Lincoln both opposed slavery as a moral issue. But Lincoln did not think that certainly a commander could act on this, and at this point he did not think he could either, for political and constitutional reasons. I'm sorry.
That's all right. David, you wrote on John Brown, and I was thinking about John Brown and how Warren felt him a liar and a terrorist. Well, then that got me to thinking about Menachem Begin in Israel and the Irgun, which was certainly a terrorist operation, but gave cover to the main movement, and
were considered freedom fighters.
Yeah, do movements such as in the Civil War need a terrorist, perhaps, if we're going to use that word, a shock value to help promote the more upstanding middle ground?
Doris Lessing wrote a book called The Good Terrorist. David Reynolds came along and did a biography of John Brown in which he, in effect, more than in effect, argues that John Brown was America's good terrorist. And I think in my own teaching for years, that's essentially how I presented John Brown. But John Brown ought to trouble us, is my view. He should not be easy to digest. He was both a revolutionary. He was both a freedom fighter and a revolutionary on the one hand, but he was also, on the other hand, a man who killed for justice. He murdered for justice. I, in fact, just lectured this week on John Brown in my course at Yale, and I make my students think carefully about this, particularly in the post-9/11 world we live in. John Brown ought to bother us, not just make us pleased with whichever narrative we prefer about him. I don't believe he was mad. I don't think there's a decent analysis out there of John Brown that shows that he was in some way insane. He wasn't insane. Stephen Oates once argued that he was monomaniacal, whatever that actually means. But he was a radical who believed that slavery was a state of war by one group of human beings against another, and he believed that any means were justified in overthrowing it. Now we have to decide for ourselves individually which side of that you want to be on.
You have to consider the political implications of that too. that could have cost the Republicans the election of 1860.
In fact,
there was a
I love to
reaction
play
that.
Absolutely. I love to play out the counterfactual about John Brown. Let's assume he's not captured in 48 hours. Let's assume the raid succeeds, even for a week or two. Let's assume he gets out of Harper's Ferry with a band of men that's bigger and grows. Let's assume he frees 100 slaves and has a slave army. And let's assume that John Brown just gets shot on a road somewhere and thrown in a ditch and the body's never even found and there's no hanging.
Right.
If this had been a prolonged operation and a bloodbath in Virginia,
Yeah.
the Republican Party would have been in huge trouble
Right.
in the next year's election. And without the gallows,
Yeah.
we wouldn't be talking about
That may
John
have
Brown.
cost Seward the
He'd be a
nomination.
footnote.
That may have cost Seward the nomination too. And Lincoln, they needed
Oh, yeah.
someone more moderate or conservative.
And Lincoln condemned John
Lincoln
Brown's
condemned it.
deeds,
Right,
but
yeah, but he
usually as a
said,
way
yeah.
of getting you to think about, but
Yeah,
there'll be
right.
more John Browns if we don't do something.
Right. Cooper Union address.
That's right, in the Cooper Union address. That's
Well,
a good
this
question.
this was fascinating. Well, it was meant to be. We didn't even get to our audience. I'm sorry about
Poor
that.
people didn't get to
But
ask
you can
all
come
the
up
questions.
afterward and ask questions and get your book signed as well. This was a good discussion. This is terrific stuff. And appreciate your both being here and your respective presses bringing you here as well. There's so much more in these books that we didn't get to. And Bill Harris's about the peace conference and Crittenden's compromise, the Army's response to preliminary emancipation and enrollment of blacks, Kentucky Governor Bramlett and his part in the story and others. There's so much more in your book that we haven't covered. It's a book that we all need to read about because that area was so crucial, as you make your point, in the war period. And for David, I mean, there's so much in here as well, such as what are the pitfalls of America's romanticization of the Civil War? And do we Civil War buffs glorify war to detriment of next generations, perhaps, who think that it's a great thing? America's particularism and how racism is involved in that. That's something that's in there. American piety and how fated tragedy is part of that. There's so much in both of these books that you have to read them. So I hope you'll be able to do that. We thank you all for joining us today at our virtual book signing event. And I want to thank the staff of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, as always, for helping us put this on. All of you who braved the rain today to come out and not stay in your computer, we appreciate that. Thank you again very much. Come back again and say hello at a virtual book signing.